Years ago, we started Fairwinds first and foremost as a services company. For us, that means humans helping humans be great at very difficult things. Since then, we've seen a massive shift in DevOps culture and tooling. We want to prepare you for the future of cloud infrastructure and help save you from the many mistakes that we've made along the way. We don't just want to do Kubernetes for you, we want to help you do it for yourself. We'll do that here on this podcast and a whole lot more. In upcoming episodes, we'll talk Kubernetes, leadership, and DevOps culture in general in ways that we hope will help you and your company successfully navigate the cloud. This is Environmentally Friendly, and I'm your host, Kendall Miller. We're here today with Emily Freeman, a speaker, a storyteller, and a developer advocate at Microsoft. Thank you for being with us, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
And by us, clearly, I mean just me.
And the audience.
and the audience that is here.
Yes.
So first of all, I mean, just tell us how you got to where you are today. You have an interesting background, interesting story.
I have a fascinating background. I could spin it. I think sometimes I feel like I sort of stumbled accidentally into this path. Every piece is kind of added together and to bring me here. So I went to school for political science. I ended up being a writer, had my daughter, had a bit of a slightly older than quarter life crisis. I was like, you know what I should be? I should be a software engineer. How hard can it be? Turns out kind of hard. But yeah, I went to code school. I survived, learned Ruby. My first job was Java. And then I had a confrontation with an ops guy on my team. And I thought, this is obnoxious. Like, this is like the third time this happened. I went into a closet and sort of angry typed this abstract, Humpty Dumpty, the story of DevOps gone wrong. And it was a hit. Like, it was a great talk. And so that's how I kind of fell into advocacy. I was like, I like talking.
Okay.
I should do more of this.
Well, so, I mean, but you were a writer before that.
I was,
and,
yes.
And how does writing inform the fact that, I mean, now you're speaking a lot. You're probably writing a lot still.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, how are the two tied together?
Yeah, I mean, it very tightly. And when I was a writer and I transitioned into tech, I thought, what a waste. Like, that was such a waste of time. This won't help me at all. But it turns out it's been an incredible gift, especially in tech.
More than just code comments?
Yes. And to-dos.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's great because I have the ability to sort of talk to people much smarter than I am, distill what they're talking about, and then kind of craft the message in a way that other audiences can understand.
So tell me, how does writing and speaking relate to each other? I mean, are you coming up with a thing, revising it, and then iterating on it, or is it different substantially?
Yeah, so I think it's very similar. I approach talks via what I call scripted storytelling. So my talks are actually written out word for word, and that enables me to walk up on stage with a lot of confidence, having chosen, every sentence thoughtfully. And I'm able to kind of build the talk from there. So I approach speaking as a form of writing. But yeah, I mean, the first iteration of any talk's always a little nerve-wracking. You don't know how it's going to stick, which jokes are going to be funny or not. Especially like different audiences around the world are kind of different. I thought I totally bombed at a Swedish conference one time, and this attendee was like, "No, you got a Swede to chuckle." That was I was like, yes.
Somebody cracked a smile. Right? You must be wild success.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's just kind of a similar thing.
Sure.
But I try and make the topics relevant to the difficulties I'm seeing technologists struggle with. And that changes as we sort of evolve and go through things.
Sure. Well, and I imagine, I was at a tech conference just this last week, and there's a lot of people who can get up and give a very deep technical, this is a problem I had, this is how I solved this problem. And most people's eyes glaze over unless it's like a super relevant problem. Yeah. And I imagine just the ability and the experience telling stories makes you really stand out in a crowd. Do you feel like it's easy to stand out just being able to tell a story, or am I projecting that?
No, I think so. I think it's really hard to make deep dives interesting.
Sure.
And to tell that story. That's what I prefer deeply technical talks to be workshops where people can participate and you kind of lead them through something. I think at conferences we need to talk about the sort of skills and philosophies we're approaching things with. I come to tech with the perspective that the challenges we face are the majority of challenges we face, let's say, aren't necessarily technical. They're human.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the times our tech is evolving much faster than we are.
Yeah.
We're sort of the slow portion of that. to catch on to things. So that's what I kind of focus on.
So talk about that. Yeah, I mean, the human side of this is really interesting, right? And I know it's something that you focus on.
Very much so.
Organizational problems. I mean, even you just wrote a book on Devops for Dummies,
Yeah.
and I imagine a lot of that's focused on the human side of that.
Very much
I mean,
so.
just talk about like where does your perspective on the human problems within an organization come from? How do you think about it? I don't know. What's getting you excited right now about it?
Yeah, I mean, I love talking to engineers. That's one of the best parts of my job as an advocate. I get to interact with technologists all over the world who are working with all sorts of stacks and all sorts of challenges. And I get to have honest conversations about the things they're doing well and the areas they're struggling with. So I think that's definitely part of it. I think the culture component, especially when you're talking about DevOps, is critical. The friction that exists for many engineers is just, it can be overwhelming. And a lot of times I think engineers feel sort of helpless to make change, especially at the sort of executive level. And so I'm trying to kind of build a culture where we can share vulnerability, like share what we're struggling with, share what we're doing well, have a learning culture as a community, but also empower developers to step up into some of these leadership roles if that's something they're interested in.
Yeah.
I'd be so bold as to say the age of the NBA is over. I would like to see engineers in some of these executive roles.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of that probably comes from a misunderstanding that everyone in an executive role knows exactly what they're doing
Yes.
and exactly how to solve it. And
Yes.
and they want the input from the engineers and they want the input from the ground level and they don't know how to fix things. And okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about your book.
Yes, so Devops for Dummies. I'm super excited about it. It was such a journey actually writing the whole thing. But it focuses on people, process, and technology in that order. I sort of start out with what is DevOps, and then how you can kind of start a DevOps transformation, persuade colleagues, get buy-in from executives, the value of DevOps for an engineering organization. And then what I try and do is kind of look at the software development lifecycle as a linear process.
Mm-hmm.
And then after we kind of talk about that, bend the line and connect those two in so that you're creating a feedback loop around the customer
Sure.
and making sure that you can iterate rapidly.
Yeah. What does your role look like in this for Microsoft? I mean, you're writing a book on DevOps for Microsoft. You're doing developer advocacy for Microsoft. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think they're bringing you in to customers to consult them on how to have the DevOps or do the DevOps. I mean, I know there's a lot of companies out there that do that. So like, what does it look like inside of Microsoft for you to be doing advocacy for them?
Mm-hmm. Advocacy is a different job every single day. Some days I'm writing a talk, other days I'm at a conference. When I am at a conference, yes, I'm usually speaking, but I think the most valuable aspect of a conference is talking to the engineers and being there as a community member. Something that I'm passionate about is looking at the people on stage not as necessarily experts, but your peers, and encouraging every engineer to sort of step up and take their seat at the table. So if I'm out at a conference, maybe I'm writing, maybe I'm doing a demo. I'm relatively new to Microsoft, so I'm still sort of learning certain Azure products. Azure is an enormous ecosystem.
Sure.
But yeah, it's just different every single day.
And before this, you were at small company.
Yes.
So talk about the transition from small company to one of the big companies.
Yeah, buckle up.
All the good and the bad.
Right?
Just share the good.
Yeah, no, I mean, small company, I've always worked for startups.
Yep.
And the gift of a startup is that you can wear many hats and you can kind of do the things you're interested in and you pivot very quickly and you can get buy-in very quickly. If you have a good idea, you just try it out and see what happens. A big company is just that. It's a big ship and it's a slow churn. There's a lot of benefits to that. You know, you have more resources. I feel like I have a platform at Microsoft to really impact the future of DevOps and SRE and engineering. So that's really compelling and exciting, but it's a totally different dynamic inside the company.
Yeah, I imagine. And tell us a little bit about the things that make Microsoft unique in the ecosystem. I mean, you're out there advocating in part for Microsoft. I mean, what makes Azure, it's the second biggest cloud, right? After AWS. Yes. Why is it the second biggest cloud? You know, why are people choosing Azure? What kinds of things does it do better than its competitors?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because AWS is the status quo. And I think when a lot of people make that decision, it's like, oh, we'll just go to AWS. And looking at Azure and GCP a little bit can sometimes be a second thought. I think every cloud has its pros and cons. I do think the thing that's compelling about Azure is it's a little bit more of an immature product. And whereas some people view that as a negative, I view that as, okay, here's a company that is actually listening to the customers. actually allowing their advocates to bring back feedback and say, this is what's going well, this is what needs to be improved, and then making those changes.
Yeah.
And so for me, the engineers actually have a say in the future roadmap, and I think that's incredible.
Yeah, I can imagine that being a significant thing, and a little bit smaller. You know, I mean, it's not like Microsoft's a small company.
No.
But the cloud compared to Amazon, I imagine they're able to pivot a little bit differently. Amazon's just out on the front, moving, changing all the time, and Azure's able to listen and change sort of responsively to customer needs and such. Okay, that's interesting. Well, so talk a little bit about just sort of the trends you see. You're out attending a lot of conferences, seeing a lot of things that are going on. What's coming next in this space? What's got you excited in the space?
I think we're at a really interesting junction in tech, specifically in relation to cloud, because we talk about cloud adoption and cloud native, and we throw this around like everyone's already got it all figured out. And the things that I'm seeing is we don't, right? Like this is a slower process. I think the majority of companies have started, and they're somewhere along that transition, or they have some services running somewhere, but they still have this other, on-prem or whatever, hybrid. And so they're kind of trying to figure out like, okay, what are the best solutions? And I'm encouraging everyone to really be thoughtful about their decisions, to not just adopt the technology because it's cool or it's sexy or whatever.
Sure.
That it's, it's actually what solves this problem, and that your engineers are comfortable with that technology. So.
But I mean, you got to push the engineers out of that box sometimes, because a lot of times, I mean, if engineers ever worked with technology they were uncomfortable with, we would all be out on the cutting edge, right?
That's true.
Aren't huge numbers of companies stuck in the past and not able to move forward with technology they're uncomfortable with?
Yes, and there's a balance there, right? Like I think for me, it's looking at making decisions to connect the dots. So for instance, if you have maybe a Ruby dev choosing a config management tool that uses that would be familiar for them,
sure,
great, that's fantastic. So it doesn't necessarily be like never adopt new tools, but think about the tools and like, okay, where are the learning opportunities for this team? And is the team as a whole ready to take that on,
Sure. Yeah, moving a bunch of COBOL engineers straight to a big Go application is probably a bit of a jump.
Absolutely.
Or they might be excellent at it. I don't know. I never actually did COBOL.
Neither did I, so I'll just pretend that I know what I'm talking about. How about that?
Okay, that's interesting. Well, and then what about, particularly, we're a Kubernetes company.
Yes.
That's all we think about. I mean, that's not all we think. We think about everything adjacent to it, but that's the world we live in.
Yes.
That's the water we swim in. Everything Kubernetes all the time. I feel like the whole world is in the midst of this monumental shift towards that. It's powering everything that isn't obviously Kubernetes. I'm just curious, I mean, where do you see the trends in Kubernetes specifically? Do you think serverless is going to eat its lunch and destroy it? Is it going to run on top of Kubernetes? I don't know. Where do those things fit?
Has any tech that's been like in an article that says X is going to eat Y's lunch ever actually done it?
I mean,
Ruby's been dead for 10 years now or something,
Sure.
No, I think Kubernetes is a fantastic tool. I think it's the right tool for a lot of scenarios. It's not a silver bullet. And so you have to kind of consider that. But I almost see like AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, you're going to probably see some more managed tools built off of it, and then maybe kind of see where orchestration goes. I'm not, I think we're in that sort of pivot point where the brilliant engineers are figuring out the holes of a Kubernetes solution and which parts of the problem it doesn't quite solve, and so kind of proceeding from there.
Yeah, it's almost how can we make this complex solution simple enough that we can go add complexity.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of this balance too, right? Like I think we're with cloud and so many like platform services, you are abstracting some of these much more complicated problem-solving tools, especially when it relates to infrastructure, and you're enabling developers to take more ownership over their code. But there's still a vast need for people with that sort of infrastructure depth.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure that like operations folks, you're not getting automated out of the job.
Right.
You still have a place. It's just we want to remove the toil. We want to remove the manual work.
The pain there. Yeah. Well, and I would think a lot of Microsoft customers specific. This is very much a stereotype. So correct me if I'm wrong.
Cool.
But that they're the people who are running in data centers that are running a lot of legacy. I mean, the people who were heavy Microsoft users 10, 15 years ago probably still are, if they're still in business. What has their move to the cloud been like? I mean, is it just a lot of lift and shift into Azure, or are they making big organizational changes? I mean, I imagine it's the whole spectrum, but
It is.
Do you have any piece in that? Are you out on the front lines of any of that?
Yeah, so I actually got to spend a lot of time with legacy Microsoft customers at our Ignite tour. So last winter we did 17 cities.
In how long?
Oh my gosh, 4 months.
Did you do all 17?
No, God, I'd be dead. I'd be on the side.
No, I was very impressed.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I did 4, and it was
Okay.
rough.
That's still a lot.
It's all
4 months.
international.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
sure.
You know, international travel. It's
Sure.
like, people think it's all champagnes and planes, and it's just not. It's hotels and sadness. But outside of that,
if you have enough champagne, then it's hotels and happiness. Come on.
That's not how that works. I want to be clear.
You're probably more connected to that reality than I am.
No, I think it was a really interesting, eye-opening experience for me to kind of talk to some of these companies who have been on Microsoft products for forever.
Sure.
And they're unsure of how different products link up with others, right?
Sure.
So like this, X got kind of transitioned to Y or got renamed to something like Azure DevOps. Like, okay, what does this mean for me? How do I keep up? And then I think there's a large spectrum of companies, right? And I think the late adopters feel some shame about like being a late adopter, but I don't think they should.
Yeah, that's
because
interesting.
certain companies just have different issues, different challenges, compliance challenges, security challenges. They can't, move as fast as an SF startup. So yeah, it's a wide variety of challenges.
No, that's actually really interesting. Something I've never thought about is companies that feel shame for being slow. Like, oh, well, everybody's gone to the cloud and I haven't gotten there yet. And what do we do to get there? And those kinds of things. That's pretty fascinating to me. I'm curious, like when you talk to these kinds of companies, what's the advantage of them getting to a cloud world? I mean, is it, are they able to iterate faster? Are they able to, I feel like I know the answers to these things, but I'm curious your answers to those things.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the pitch for Azure? Like, why the cloud over their data center or, their sysadmin's back closet or wherever they're storing their data?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the overall answer is that you are enabled to develop faster, better, and typically cheaper, right? So pay as you go is really powerful in that you are literally only paying for the services you use when you use them. That's compelling. You don't have to maintain your own physical hardware.
Right.
But outside of that, I think it provides more, in some ways more abstractions, but in other ways more control, right? Like you're able to actually see, okay, this is my system as a whole, and everyone on your team can have access to the portals and the code, especially if you're doing something like infrastructure as code, and being able to sort of share that source code, I think is important.
Yeah, and in the world of DevOps for Dummies,
yes,
I've read a lot of that series of books, the 4
Have you?
Dummies. Well, and I don't consider myself
Are
a
you done?
huge dummy. So yeah, I mean, like that's part of it, right? Is like it's not written for idiots, right?
No.
It's written for people who just want a beginning point, right?
Yes.
Like it's a 101, it's
Yeah.
an introduction. So those companies that are slower to move and are just getting started in some of that transformation. I don't know, what kinds of things would you say to them? What if you're sitting down with an executive at one of these big companies that's making this big change?
Yeah.
What do you tell them about like how you should go about this, why it matters for your organization? What would you say?
I think the market is evolving. If you don't make changes and make steps to move toward the cloud and adopt some of these newer ways of solving problems, you're going to lose out to your competitors who are doing just that. You're also going to start struggling with talent, right? I think the engineers evolve as much as tech evolves.
Sure, that's interesting.
Yeah, and so you have to kind of look at that. But I think for me, the biggest mistake companies make when trying to make these changes is they try and like boil the ocean,
Sure.
They do everything at one time. We're gonna rewrite our monolith into microservices. We're gonna lift and shift to the cloud. We're gonna do all these things. CI/CD, yes,
Right.
It's like, one step at a time. And
Right.
it doesn't really matter what that step is. Like just pick one thing and do that thing really well. And so like, for instance, like if you are still a legacy monolith, that's fine, right? Like a well-architected monolith is better than a spaghetti code microservice, or what I like to call macro services. 'Cause those exist, yes.
Yeah.
But I think like if you're doing that, take the services that are used most frequently, take the services that are problematic, and pull those components out.
Sure.
Start slow.
So the engineers wanting to work with cloud first infrastructure, I mean, is that just because engineers want to be able to put Azure on their resume, or is it because it's actually a better experience for them? Like, why do you think that matters?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think there is some resume-driven development.
Sure.
It's important. Like, I mean, remember like 3 or 4 years ago, if you added DevOps to your resume, it was like a $40,000 bump in salary.
Right.
That's compelling.
Yeah.
I would encourage every engineer to take advantage of that. I think the new thing is
DevOps manager.
Yes, exactly.
Manager of the DevOps.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do the DevOps.
Yeah.
And so that is important. And it's something to keep in mind when you are looking at your hiring and retention and keeping talent. But I also think that, engineers see ways for their job to embody less friction, to remove some of this toil, this sort of rote manual work that they're used to doing. If you look at like old traditional engineering orgs and deployments were like this 4-page document that you just like follow instructions and it's never updated.
Yep.
One man knows all the things, and then they quit, and then everything.
My favorite
falls
kind
apart.
of man.
Yes, exactly. And so you run into weird issues, but you can, with some of these more cloud-oriented solutions. I mean, how compelling is it to deploy with a click of a button? Or like when you merge, it just deploy. Like, this is
which
fascinating.
Well, I mean, it should be obvious to me, but I'm always, I'm seeing the shift towards service ownership of teams, right? Like, hey, I deployed a thing into production. I can see the impact of that. I need to own whether that service is up and running.
Yes.
And I've always seen that from the manager perspective of like, yes, I want you to own the things that you build, because if you build terrible things, that should be your problem.
Yes.
But I haven't actually, I mean, it's kind of funny to me that it's never actually occurred to me that as an engineer, you probably delight in the fact that, hey, I can see this thing running in production. I have some say over how well it's running in production, all of that.
I mean, when I was an engineer, the biggest frustrations I had was having no access to certain logs, certain telemetry. When you do have that traditional split between developers and operations folks, you miss out on so much collaboration because I can't actually see what the problem is. I can see my code, but you can't see my code.
Right.
And I can't see, the logs from the CDN that you manage. Like, that's where things get really complicated. So opening up all the books, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just handing your code over the wall for someone else to write. It's then them talking through the wall for you to try to, the two of you to try to troubleshoot. It's like talking on the phone with your grandma trying to figure out how to fix her computer.
I know. Though, can I just tell you, anecdotally, my father, I called him today, and he was like, oh, I'm on the line with your mom. Do you want me just to, plug you in? I was like, wait, you can do that? He's like, yeah, hang on. I'm like, Dad,
well
good job.
Done. Yeah, no, that's... I still remember my mom calling me in and asking me which way the floppy goes in.
Oh, God.
And then when the thing came up and said, are you sure you want to print, panicking and coming and getting me? And I was like, well, do you want to print? Yeah, well then hit the OK button. I love my mom. She's very bright. The computer is very intimidating for her.
But I think that's a lesson. Like, writing this book was a lesson to me in how much jargon we use every day. My editor, Susan, many thanks to Susan. She made this book 1,000 times better, which, remind me about that because I have another thought on that. But she kept asking, like, what is this? What do you keep saying? Like, things like spinning up resources. Well, what does spinning up mean? We use things that we consider just to be totally simple and clear, but to a layman, to someone who's not as familiar, maybe to an executive who, wants to maintain authority and is afraid to ask these questions. Sure. We obfuscate so much of our work.
So did you put little tips in there that say spin up means this, or did you change the language completely?
Sometimes I did it. It was both, right? Both. So sometimes I would put in parentheses like, here's what the meaning is. Sometimes it'd be like, instantiate X.
Sure.
But, yeah.
So then talk about your editor.
Yeah. So my editor, it was such a meta experience because Susan came in and edits are made in big, bright red font.
Sure.
Right? So it's just like, you're terrible. That's what it is.
Oh yeah.
Okay. But it's an adversarial relationship, and it reminded me of DevOps, right? Like I wrote something, I built something, very much like code. I shipped it to my editor. Yep. She criticized it. Yep. And it's you can look at it as an adversarial relationship, or you can look at it as sort of like a really healthy friction where you're making each other better, right? Like it's sort of a grindstone.
It's a code review.
It's a code review, yes. But so much of that is determined by attitude, not actual action.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I spend a significant amount of my day telling people, you want to solve this tension, but your job is to be in this tension constantly. Like you're never going to solve this. You have to keep arguing with that person. Like, figure out a way forward, but this is going to be problematic forever. You're supposed to live in tension. Product is always supposed to be grumpy with engineering and the other way around. And that's what helps us move forward and know, okay, where is the line? How far can we push? Those kinds of things.
Yes, really this is actually something I've thought about a lot recently, and it's sort of how, because we want to remove unnecessary friction, but some friction is still really healthy. If you're around a bunch of people that are different than you, that can be uncomfortable. That can be weird. But that friction makes us all better. You get to see things from a perspective you can't because of the body you're in or your experience or your education. And so that's a really special experience. And there's a Buddhist, and I'm far from an expert in this, so like forgive me, but there's a Buddhist concept of the middle way.
Sure.
Where it's sort of like this, you're walking a tightrope between two extremes, and it's holding that tension. And it's never going to be perfect because you're walking on the razor's edge. But by trying to pursue that, I think you can become, more and more better.
More and more better.
Yeah, that's good.
All the
good
better.
English. I'm a writer.
It's almost like you do this for a living.
It's all about not having any ego,
right.
because if you have ego and then you screw up, like forget it.
Yes.
Good
Well,
luck.
I mean, and an editor that reads that and is like, "You moron! You literally do this for a living." I'm sure that comes up in code reviews all the time. Like, "No, you moron! You really do this for a living." Well, so then one thing I want to ask you: you travel a lot more broadly than I do, and probably more broadly than most of us do. Talk about just sort of the different organizational things you see culturally. I mean, or even just globally. Are we ahead of Europe? Are we behind Europe? What about other parts of the world? If you're out in Asia.
So I see the most interesting differences actually in the U.S. And partially because it's hard to tell when you're traveling internationally what is an engineering culture and what's just a people culture and how those impact things. But for us, at the beginning of writing the book, I really struggled. Where okay, who is this for, right? What is the book that I want to write? Who do I want to help? And I settled on a CIO of a small insurance company in Hartford, Connecticut, with 15 years of legacy code and interesting compliance concerns. Because I think solving for those problems is much more interesting, much more compelling than the sort of sexy hand wavy bits of DevOps, like Greenfield, everything works, it's perfect, everyone gets along, it's unicorns and rainbows. And so, I think when you look at
which unicorns and rainbows, I don't know why those always go together, but continue.
Yeah, they do. Side note, I talk a lot about quitting tech and buying a goat farm. And I must talk about this enough that my daughter was like, "Can we get a unicorn for the farm?" It's like, I will put a horn on a horse. I will do that.
There must be rainbows.
Right? There will be rainbows. Make it happen.
That's right.
But yeah, so when you look at Silicon Valley and the sort of startup scene and the VC and the always at the cutting edge. And then you look at a place like Hartford, Connecticut, who much older companies, much more business-oriented way of doing things. Don't necessarily consider themselves tech companies, even though tech has become a huge portion of their business. And so approaching those two different companies is it's going to be wildly different. Yeah.
Well, so then talk about organizational change, organizational growth. I mean, organizations undergo changes to do the DevOps.
Yes.
Is there something? I mean, is there a point in the organization where I guess San Francisco companies or high tech companies that are starting out, they're probably going to implement some of these new practices because they're considered new best practices, from the get go. Does a company have to reach a certain point of maturity where it's able to make that change? And I mean, do you see it around a certain number count, a certain whatever? I mean, how do you think about that?
Yes, 88 is the
88.
88 employees.
Oh, okay.
You're good. You'll be
89.
fine.
You got the DevOps. 87. You still are doing the waterfall.
No, I think it's just going to vary from organization to organization. So much of this has to do with who the founders are. I mean, founders have an incredible amount of influence over the company culture, which is why thinking about how you want to sort of scale your organization is important to think about at the beginning, even though it feels not important because you're barely trying to scrape together some users. But yeah, I think the maturity models of a company are really interesting. I have a talk called Scaling Sparta, and I kind of compare what I think are the 3 stages of a company, which is that infant startup, the sort of mid-size company or late-stage startup, that startup's 10 years old but still calls itself a startup, and then an enterprise. And I compare them to the military organizations of the Spartans, the Mongols, and the Romans.
Okay.
Because the Spartans, about 10,000 men strong, that a very specific way of approaching war. Obviously, war was their like thing.
Yep.
And then the Mongols were fascinating, about 100,000. And then the Romans peaked at roughly 500,000. And so kind of looking at like how each of these organizations grew their troops, what they prioritized, how they took care of their people. I think it's a really interesting approach to tech, right? Tech is still very new. And I think sometimes we forget that we're a very young industry. You know, we feel very important, and there's a lot of sort of praise about tech right now, which is great. Like
we are important.
I know.
Don't break this for me.
I know. I'm sorry. Other people are important too.
Well, I'm told.
But,
sorry, keep going.
No, yeah. So I think it's important to look at some of these older industries, these older ways of solving the same kinds of human problems that we're running up against. But yeah, where you adopt things has so much more to do, I think, with your customers, your products, and your actual engineering team, what they can implement, more so than your size.
Okay. And then, I mean, how do you level up from one to the next?
Yeah.
We're still startup-y, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on if you're measuring based on profit or people.
Yeah.
But
which is interesting.
What does that look like in the maturity? And do you have any advice?
I'll say something somewhat controversial. I think founders have like a 3 to 4 year clock, and then they should move on. And it reaches this point where like founders are the people I believe function really well at that Sparta stage. Don't typically work well at an enterprise stage.
But Mark Zuckerberg, he's never messed anything up.
No comment. Sorry.
I'm allowed to comment. Yeah, that's right. That's my comment too. Woo. Okay.
No, poor man. Poor billionaire. So I think when you're taking a founder who is gifted at building something from nothing, you know, that is a particular type of human being, which is incredible. But that type of human being typically does not translate well into, okay, how do you start to add process? How do you start to respect other skill sets? How do you introduce management structure and hierarchy, but not be overbearing, right? You still want to maintain autonomy and allow your teams to have, like mastery over their work, right? And then
they reach a certain size where they just become incompetent at that. And so
at some size though, you can afford to be incompetent, right?
Yeah.
Like you have enough money that like if you make a mistake, typically you're gonna be fine. Like there's exceptions to that, but there is this size where it's like if you screw up, you'll just buy a company that did it better.
It's like my life dream to reach that stage where like we can literally mess everything up. And it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We're gonna be just fine.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Knight Capital comes to mind as an exception to that. Yeah, they really messed that
well,
one up.
there's some big, you know, there's Enrons out there.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
Not just in tech.
No, it's true.
Okay, well then talk about cloud transformation, DevOps transformation, organizational transformation. I don't know, pick from one of those three buckets. For companies that aren't tech companies. You know, how are they approaching this, thinking about this? Do you talk to these kinds of folks?
Yeah.
And how do they think about, I don't know, these big organizational changes? Is it different from the way the tech folks think about it?
Yes, I think so. And I think it comes a lot down to the sort of background and the way people communicate, right? I think we underestimate how much of our communication style and how we actually, the actual language we use with each other influences our belief system and how we kind of approach things. And so if you have a business background, if you have a fashion background, you're going to be thinking about things a little bit differently than if you have a purely tech background. I think when we're in tech, we're talking about companies that serve developers, but there are so many tech companies that serve non-developers, right? Everyone else. So you kind of have to approach things just in a very DevOps fashion by centering your customer. Who is your customer? What did they need?
Sure.
I think that's the key component there.
Well, so then, you know, as we get towards close here, I mean, where do you see this all going in 10, 15 years? Do you have a feeling?
Up. It's just
blow up. It's all just going to cave in. Yeah, so get our money now and get out? Is that what you're saying?
Very much so. No, this is a side note, but I run, J. Paul Reed does this great open space at DevOps Days called K-Talk.
Yep.
And I ran it recently, and I was just like, you know, I think we're at the high end of a growth. And so maybe save some money. That's all I'm saying. And they were like, we don't need to save money. Tech will be around forever. And I was like, yeah, but things change. And, and you can have, like, if you have a huge portion of layoffs in, you know, X city, and 10,000 people have your exact skill set, gets a little tricky.
It's a little tricky. I have a good friend who works for Google. He moved from the oil industry to Google, and I went to visit him at the office, and he walks me around. And he's like, "Look, we have, a fireplace in the shape of a Colorado flag, and we have a gondola for meeting rooms, and we have." And he's like, "Don't get me wrong, these things are nice."
Yeah.
And he goes, "But I've worked in oil and gas. I know what a bubble looks like."
Oh yeah.
He's like, "I'm gonna enjoy my massage chair for now,
That's
but
exactly
this isn't gonna last for forever."
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
no, but I think like looking at
doom and gloom. That's not where I expected you to go.
No, I think coming to it with humility,
Sure.
and making sure that we don't actually believe our own bullshit, and that we, make sure that hubris does not overpower the things that we started in tech with, which is a passion for building amazing products, and building out amazing systems, That's what I want to keep us focused on, not the money, nothing like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's still so many industries that we have yet to disrupt.
Absolutely.
That I don't think I thought of biking around the city as an industry that needed to be disrupted by tech, and it's been disrupted by tech, or scooters.
Absolutely.
Right? Like that's not top of, even just like taxis isn't something I would have thought of, and I'm sure there's a million things out there that we just haven't thought of, and somebody's going to, and it's going to be, the revolution is just beginning. But yes, I think there are many bubbles sort of along this way as the transformation takes place.
Let me add this. I think as we sort of evolve the industry, I think some of the most compelling innovations over the next decade or two will come out of places like India, like China, and Africa. I mean, even Microsoft is investing heavily in Africa. I think some of the tech environments and communities there are primed for innovation and primed for solving problems we are not even aware of in a really authentic way. The other part is I would like to see more tech companies solve problems for people who actually need it, rather than making middle-class people more comfortable. I feel like so many of our products make people that are already doing okay just more comfortable. Like an Uber comes to mind for this. You can get a taxi, but an Uber is more convenient. There's nothing wrong with that. But I would love to see us disrupt things like predatory lending.
Yep.
Let's disrupt
Payday
those
loans,
markets. Exactly.
yeah, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Sure.
So,
And there's people out there working to try to do some of those things, but there's a lot of innovation yet to come. Wow.
Absolutely. I'm excited to watch it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, anything I'm missing? Anything I should be asking you?
No.
Okay.
Settled it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. Some words of insight and some doom and gloom about the future from Emily.
And some good things.
And some good things, and some things that Microsoft's doing uniquely well, and that you're doing uniquely well. And thank you so much for being with us.
Cool.
Until next time.